Thanks a bunch. Thanks for coming out. It's a gorgeous day, so I don't know why you're here, but I'm glad you are. It is a little warm. Although my wife is currently in the air flying, she has work this week in Tucson, and I think the low was something in the hundreds this week, so good luck to her. Um, yeah, thanks so much for having me. I don't know how many of you have heard me talk before, but a smattering. Uh, I'm going to start with the same story I start 90% of my speaking engagements with. And the reason I do it is that if you haven't heard me speak before, it gives you a good sense of where I'm coming from, literally and figuratively. And I also, honestly, it's a little bit for me too, because it gets me centered and reminds me where I came from. There's no question that I simply wouldn't be here or any place if it wasn't for a book called Population 485. And Population 485, my gosh, it came out in 2002, so it's been out over 20 years. Seems like 2 years. And Population 485, it's that old Can You Go Home Again book. It's been written many, many times by many, many people, many different ways. In my case, I wrote about going back to my hometown of New Auburn, Wisconsin, Population 485, after 12 years away. And when I moved back to New Auburn, I am by nature a loner and very shy. This up here I can do, I've learned how to do it and I enjoy it, but I am an introvert otherwise. I would prefer to never come out of my little room. I'm happy in there reading books or writing books. And when I moved back to New Auburn, I'm just not a joiner. I always say, I moved back to New Auburn. I don't drink, so I didn't go into any of the local taverns. I didn't belong to any of the local churches. I don't play softball. I don't bowl, and I can't polka. So there really wasn't much left except to join the local volunteer fire department, which I did. And then Population 45 basically is about me rediscovering the people in the place, one ambulance call, one fire call at a time. I work with a lot of folks on the coast, mostly New York, but lately LA, and I am still on the volunteer fire department. I don't make many calls anymore, but I am still active and just recertified. And they'll find out, these folks in LA or New York, that I'm a volunteer firefighter, EMR, and they'll say, "Oh, you must be very brave and noble." And I always say, not especially. And then I explain to them that when you come from a place like I do, New Auburn, I got the two things they're looking for in a volunteer firefighter: a pulse and a valid driver's license. Plus, as a self-employed writer, I'm home a lot during the day. So, and the other thing is that they don't realize is that when I moved back to New Auburn, my two brothers and my mom were already on the fire department. So it was mainly a peer pressure situation. I just didn't want to be the only one without stories when we got together. So since Population has come out, and honestly, to this day, I received an email just within the last week. I've had so many letters and emails and comments on social media from people who say, "Well, we read your book about life in a small town and we loved it. We loved it so much that we've sold everything and we're moving to a small town." And I always go, "Well, hang on there, Spanky." Because small towns can be hard places. They got long memories. You can be 50 years old trying to live down something that happened when you was 15 in the gravel pit. And even in my case, as I said, when I moved back, I had a lot of trepidation, and that trepidation came from the fact that I'd been away for 12 years. And so when I moved back to New Auburn, I wasn't the same guy as when I left. And the way that I always put it is that when I left New Auburn, I was a farm boy, a good student, and a fair defensive end. I returned 12 years later, a long-haired writer with soft hands and a nursing degree. So there was a certain amount of street cred to recover with some of my buddies in the deer hunting crowd. I've since had to update the anecdote specifically as it pertains to the long hair. For years, I had long hair, waist length. There's two reasons I no longer have long hair, and the first, sadly, is just generalized crop failure. Just got to the point where there was no point. And the other reason is I was looking in the mirror one day, and it was still very long in back, but it was starting to get really thin on top. And I thought, you know, you really ought to cut it off. You're headed for the Ben Franklin look. But I hadn't made the move yet, and we got paged out to fight a grass fire in the railroad tracks south of town. I'm right up in the teeth of the flames, knocking it down, fighting from the black, as any well-trained wildland firefighter will tell you that you must. But I was right up in there, and all of a sudden one of the other firefighters ran up and started patting me. Now, normally, you don't get a lot of that. So I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Man, your hair's on fire." And indeed, it was crackling right along. So at that point, I thought, you know, if it ain't falling out, it's bursting into flames. I'm just going to cut it off. And then the other thing, after being away for 12 years, that I really had to overcome was, and I've heard them all, were all the stereotypes about male nurses. So I grew up on a little dairy farm north of New Auburn, Wisconsin. Grew up baling hay, milking cows. And then in the winter, we logged, so I grew up logging all winter long. And then at the age of 16, I started working every summer on a ranch in Wyoming, a regular working beef and hay ranch. I rode Roundup, did branding, and then I worked on the hay crew. And so basically for 5 years from the age of 16, that's what I did. And because of that overlap, that's basically how I paid for college. I'd go out and work all summer long on the ranch, and then I'd bring my wages back, and I would apply them towards my tuition at the UW Eau Claire. And I am here to tell you I was the only cowboy in all of Wyoming who was putting himself through nursing school. And I base this on several conversations I had around the old Brandon fire. I was what they call a header, which meant we'd go out in the morning on the horses. We'd gather up all the cattle from, it was a giant ranch. We'd gather them all up and near these outdoor corrals that were in the middle of nowhere. And then I would switch over to being a header, which meant I would be in the corral. The cowboys would rope the calf. They would bring it into the branding area. I would meet the horse, grab the rope, slide down the rope till I came in contact with the calf. I would throw the calf and then wrestle it, as they called it, and I would hold it while I was branded and vaccinated. So I would be down on the ground there in the dust and the mud and the whatever else. And some crusty old cowboy would walk up behind me with a red-hot branding iron, and he'd say, "Where are you from, son?" "Wisconsin." "What do you do?" "I'm going to college." "What for?" "I want to be a nurse." They get really quiet out there on the prairie. And I will never forget the night that I told my dad I wanted to be a nurse. I wasn't too concerned. My father is a very gentle man, a reflective man, a hard-working farmer. But nonetheless, you're a 17-year-old kid, and you're the leading tackler on the New Auburn Trojans football team, and you decide, tonight's the night I'm going to tell Dad I want to be a nurse. It's a moment. So we was walking out to the barn after eating supper. I was about 5 paces behind him, and I said, "Dad, I want to be a nurse." And he stopped, and he turned, and he looked at me, and he said, "Well, your mother is a nurse. It's a noble profession. I think you'll make a fine nurse." And he turned and started to walk to the barn. Then he stopped and turned back. He said, "There is just one thing." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I just want to be there when they pin that little white cap on you." So anyways, I get back to New Auburn, been away for 12 years, so I'm just trying to look for signs to tell me whether or not this has been the right decision. Am I going to be able to find my way back into the community? And the story I tell in the book is that the biggest event of the year in New Auburn, population 485, is Jamboree Days. And Jamboree Days consist basically of a 5-minute parade and a softball tournament. And the proceeds from the softball tournament serve as a fundraiser for the local park. So as members of the volunteer fire department, we're expected to run the softball tournament fundraiser. Now, in addition to the softball tournament as fundraiser, directly adjacent to the softball field is a beer tent. We also run the beer tent. Ain't gonna lie to you, that is where most of the fundraising happens. So, at the time of the story, New Auburn has only one softball field and no lights on that softball field, but the softball tournament has become very popular. And so in order to get all the teams through the brackets, they got to start playing softball at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. They play all day long until dark. They resume play at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, and they play all day long until the tournament has been resolved. So shortly after I moved back, Jamboree Days rolls around. I'm still looking for signs to decide if I've made the right decision. I get assigned the duty of going down to the park on Sunday morning of Jamboree Days to clean up the beer tent, get it ready for the day. The chief sends me down there with an old-timer, a veteran on the department, a guy I've known ever since I was a little kid, and as a matter of fact, he still makes my venison sausage for me. And his name is Bob the One-Eyed Beagle. Now, Bob gets his nickname from the fact, and by the way, I'll get to this in a minute, but Bob knows about this story. Bob has approved everything you're about to hear. So, Bob the One-Eyed Beagle gets his nickname from the fact that he is severely cross-eyed. And I know there's a fancier medical name for it, but that's the bottom line. And when I say severely, that one eye is not just a little bit off, it's shot. If his good eye is looking due south, that other eye is looking due east. And in the book, I wrote about it, and very specifically, and I asked Bob if he minded, and he said no. But there's no question that when I tell this story, when I get to this point, there's always a little bit of tension in the room, and I've even had people come up to me afterward and say, it's insensitive how you describe his eye. And all I can say to them is, he's aware. Like, he's checked it out in the mirror and everything from both angles. Plus, Bob is one of these guys, and everybody in this room knows a version of this guy. That eye is the least of his problems. This is a guy, he's got one eye, one kidney, and two ex-wives, both of whom work at the only gas station in town. So he's got to run 9 miles south to Bloomer every morning for gas, coffee, and chew, because they ain't serving him at the home place. So don't worry about his feelings. So anyways, me and the Beagle, we get sent down to the park. We get down to the park. It's 8:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. First softball game of the day is already underway. We're in the beer tent picking up paper plates and plastic cups and napkins. And this guy wanders in off the street, not a softball player, just a civilian. And he says, "Could I get a beer?" And I said, "Well, it is 8:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but Beagle, you've been on the department longer. You make the command decision." And the Beagle says, "Well, I guess there's no law against it." And so he goes around behind our little makeshift bar there, and he draws the guy a beer, and he sets it down. The guy hands his money over. He puts both elbows on the plywood, and he raises the beer to his lips, and he's just about to take a pull at the foam when he hears the crack of the bat on the softball field adjacent, and he freezes. And then he looks. Then he brings his lips back in line with the beer, which has not moved, and says, "A little early in the morning for softball." And it's at that point that I said, "Yes, I am back among my people." So after I wrote Population 485, I wrote a book called Truck, A Love Story. And I get asked all the time in interviews, is that a love story about a truck or a woman? And I always respond with a question of my own, is there not room enough in a man's heart for both? Your answers will vary. But it is indeed, I was a bachelor for 39 years. There's a lot of reasons for that, and that's not what we're here to talk about today. But I was a bachelor for 39 years, and then while I was writing this book, and that was not part of the pitch for the book, but while I was writing that book, one day I went to the library and I met a woman. And I've told the American Library Association they're free to use that quote in all their promotional materials. So far, nothing. So indeed, it is a love story. It's about meeting this woman at the library. I don't want to give away the ending, but it's, I think 19 years now. Yeah. So, but it is also a book about. It is a love story about a truck, in particular, a 1951 L120 3/4 ton long bed International Harvester pickup truck. I love it very much. But part of the whole shtick of the book, it's not a shtick because it's true, is that I was raised farm kid, man. I like getting in there, getting greasy and wrenching stuff. I don't mind sweating. I love physical labor. But from an early age, it was evident that I just have no mechanical aptitude. Like when I worked in Wyoming, I could do the basics. I can change out a spun bearing. I can do bubblegum welding. I can do the basics. But once you're into the engine, or electricity is another one. As far as I'm concerned, it's magic. I don't understand it. But I never had the aptitude for mechanics. Although because of how I was raised, and I wrote about this in Truck, I know how to act around an engine, which is really half the battle. So if you came from where I come from, this is one of my all-time favorite guys looking under hoods moves, right? The truck won't start, you lift the hood, and you lean in there, you wiggle a couple of things, and at some point you scratch and spit. And then at some point you stand up and you back away and you utter my all-time favorite guys looking under hoods line, which is you go, yeah, looks like we're going to have to pull her. I got no idea what you do with her once you pull her, but I know you got to pull her. So part of the whole process of that book is that I had to find someone who actually knew what they were doing. And so I worked a trade with my brother-in-law, Mark. He's a superb engineer and mechanic and very roughneck Navy vet. And I said, he wanted at the time, these plasma cutters were kind of a new thing, and he wanted a plasma cutter in the worst way. And I said, I'll tell you what, if you help me tear apart and put back together this truck, we're going to need a plasma cutter. I'll buy the plasma cutter, and when the truck is finished, you get to keep the plasma cutter. I didn't tell him also, because I'm writing a book about it, that plasma cutter will be a tax-deductible business expense. Ain't lying. So my brother-in-law, Mark, becomes a big character in the book, and he helps me tear the thing apart. But the arc of the book is me trying to get that truck going. And then the other thing that is not obvious about the book Truck from the cover or the title or anything is that Truck is actually a gardening book. It's about a year in the life of my garden. And I wanted to write a gardening book because I'd had it up to here with happy gardening books. I felt it was time for a grim gardening book, and I'm the guy to write it. So, as a matter of fact, I don't mean to brag, but one of the most popular lines I've ever written is in the book Truck, and it's about gardening. So the way I set up the book is each chapter represents a month in the year of my garden. So chapter 2, for instance, is about my favorite gardening month of the year in Wisconsin, January. Because that's when the seed catalogs come, right? And you sit down you got your little mug of tea, and you got those catalogs with the beautiful, rich colored photos and the poetic descriptions, and you just order stuff left and right, and half of it's never even going to hit the dirt, let alone come to fruition. And so in that book, I wrote a line that turns out to be, and the reason I know it's popular is that in ebook versions, you can actually see how many times people have underlined something you've written. Not that a guy would ever go looking for that kind of stuff. But one of the most underlined things I wrote in the book, Chuck, and it's a little dated, but I think everybody in the room is going to get it. I said, seed catalogs are responsible for more unfulfilled fantasies than Playboy and Enron combined. And people seem to agree, so after Truck, I wrote a book called Coop, and book titles, that's always tricky, coming up with a good title. So I love to give the example of Population 485, which I believe is the perfect title. And I'm happy to say that because it ain't bragging, because I had a list of about 30, and they're still somewhere in existence, 30 titles for that book, and they were awful. Not a one of them worked. They were either corny or they didn't convey the book. And one day, this was pre-Zoom, but I was sitting in New Auburn, Wisconsin on speakerphone, and there was a whole long table of publicity and promo people sitting at a long conference room table in Manhattan, Midtown, at HarperCollins on the 17th floor of a big glass building. And it was basically, we were down to the wire, and we had to pick a title. And I'd thrown all mine, and they were awful, and everyone else. And I like to make fun of the people in the city occasionally for the thing. They're terribly worried about us provincials. And sometimes I take great pleasure in reminding them that sometimes out here in the Midwest, we think things up all by ourselves. But this is a case where tables turn, because we're sitting there and there's all this discussion, and all of a sudden I hear this young woman who's there as a publicist or something, and she's scanning the manuscript, and she just said, "Oh, what about just Population 485?" And immediately I'm like, of course, that tells you what this story is going to be about. So full credit. So the book Coop, it's a memoir about growing up on the dairy farm and about my parents and my childhood. I was raised in a very unusual, an obscure fundamentalist Christian sect. I like to say that because it makes people uncomfortable. It was also absolutely true, and it was the most gentle. My parents are part of it to this day, and I am not. But here's what I have to say about that. They were gentle and loving. I just had the most blessed childhood, and I say I can no longer pretend to believe as my parents do, but I try every day to be more like them. That's the bottom line. So I write a lot about that unusual childhood, and all of my parents took in legions of foster children, and I have many adopted siblings, and my mom did respite care for terminally ill children. I mean, I grew up with death and tube feedings, and oxygen tanks were just a part of supper. And so I write about that, and I write about growing up on the farm, but also another thread of that book is my wife and I, we've gotten married. There's a baby on the way. When I met my wife, she was a single mom, and she had a 3-year-old daughter, so I immediately became, I've never cared for the term stepdaughter, and some of you have heard me tell this story, but it doesn't offend me. You won't hurt my feelings. I won't get upset. But what I've always said is that the term stepdaughter, it is perfectly sufficient in conveying the situation. It is utterly insufficient in conveying the heart. And I was given the wonderful gift of a beautiful word by a roughneck, backwoods-dwelling Vietnam vet poet buddy of mine one day when he said, "She's not your stepdaughter, she's your given daughter." And I think that's a lovely way, to him, yeah. And that's how I feel. So we have this blended family, and we're on good terms. Her father lives in Colorado, but there's communication. She grew up with us, but there's communication. But we moved to this farmhouse, basically at the end of a long dead-end road, and then there's a long dead-end driveway, and then we're in this old slantways farmhouse. And when I say slantways, and when we moved there, my wife is very pregnant with our second. When I say that it's an old slantways farmhouse, so our house, that we live in, it originated as a log cabin built in the 1880s, and that part is really cool because you can stand in the living room and you can still see the exposed hand-hewn logs, and they're broad and solid, and they lend the center of the house a great, solidity. Unfortunately, since the 1880s, there have been a number of remodels and additions committed by people you wouldn't necessarily refer to as carpenters. More like farmers with hammers. And so as a result, there's just all kinds of things like the stair risers are different heights. When you walk down the upstairs hall, you have to tip your head. There's windows kind of cut in half. And then probably the best way to describe what I mean when I say it's a slantways farmhouse is if you're standing in our kitchen and you want to walk into the living room, you have to step up a little 4-inch riser. You're now in the living room. You go through the living room, past the wood stove, around the center of the house, up the hallway, past the bathroom, into the kitchen, where you find yourself back at the little 4-inch riser, having never gone down a 4-inch riser. So it's basically like living inside one of them M.C. Escher drawings. You just keep going up the magic step. But anyways, we're standing in the middle of this old slantways farmhouse at the end of these 2 dead-end roads, and it's the middle of the winter, and the snow is pelting down and stacking up outside, and my wife is looking at me, and she's very, very pregnant. And she looks at me, and she says, I want to have this child in this house. And I said, and then as I wrote in the book, her gaze hardened, and I realized not only was it going to happen, I didn't have a vote. But so part of the book is talking about building up to we did indeed wind up having a home birth. And I think the last thing I would say about that book is there's a scene in there. I've already referred to the fact that my given daughter's father lives in Colorado. He had since married. She has 2 brothers that live in Colorado. And although she was raised in our house, we always had, he and I communicated, emails, phone calls. We would take her to their family reunions so that she knows that whole side of her family. And it was just probably one of the greatest days of my life was her high school graduation when he and I got to stand together and watch her walk across that stage. Because I said, man, we made it. You know, it wasn't easy always, and it took 4 people. That's the other thing. People say, oh, it's so wonderful what you did. I was like, no, there were 4 people who agreed, and believe me, we had discussions, literally had to sit down at tables sometimes, but to make it to that point. But my favorite story about trying to explain to people, I don't know, you can say blended family, whatever the term, but my favorite story that just sums up the ease with which we managed to handle this is the big day arrives, and my younger daughter is born. We're upstairs in our old farmhouse. The child is safely cradled in her mother's arms. My given daughter, who at that point is 7 years old, is just jumping up and down, just pogoing with excitement. And she says, can I call my dad? Can I call my dad? And I said, absolutely, call your dad. Tell our Colorado families, we call them, that we have a new sister. She goes pelting down the stairs. I hear her pick up the phone. I hear her dial, and then I hear his voice at the other end. And with no preface whatsoever, she says, well, you're a dad again. It's like, yeah. Kinda. So I'm going to keep an eye. By the way, I bumped this before I got up. I trust it's still operating. We're good? Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to skip to a couple other books, and then we are going to have good 15 minutes of Q&A, so if I missed anything, you can go ahead and hit me up on that. I mentioned those folks in New York and how I like to occasionally listen. There's enough tribalism in our society right now. I'm not interested in that. That's not what this is about. The people in New York and lately some people in LA have changed my life. They've done their jobs professionally. I've loved working with them. I've learned so much from them. But as I said, occasionally I just like to yank their chain just a little bit. Or it's just fun to see what they're impressed by. I've been working on a project recently. I have an attorney in LA, an entertainment attorney. I've never actually met him, but I looked him up on the internet. He appears to be 12, but he did a heck of a job on the contract, so we're going with it. But one of his traits is he's just super businesslike. and very friendly, very cordial, but there's just never any joking around or, hey, how are the kids? Or it's just like business, business, business. And one day in about February, back when we had, up there at least, we had a huge dump of the super heavy snow and all the trees are bowed down and you can't, and I had gone out to plow and I had taken just a picture from behind the wheel of the plow and making that first pass. And so I'm emailing back and forth with this attorney in LA and he's being very businesslike. And then somehow he had mentioned something about it was 55 degrees in LA that day and they were all wearing their sweaters. And so I just sent him back a photo taken from inside the cab of the truck with the snowplow. And in a split second, he replies, all caps with exclamation points, "You have your own snowplow." Like, yes, I do. I got the softest hands in my family, and even it was like one time the publicist in New York they were putting together a thing for one of my book tours, and we were in this meeting, and the publicist said to another publicist, well, Mr. Perry, he has a snowplow, he has his own pickup truck, he's on the fire department, and he has his own deer rifle. And I said, yeah, just like my mom. But I think for the last couple of minutes before we go to Q&A, I've written 2 books in the last couple of years that I knew going in not all of my audience was going to love them. And that's not a flip comment, and I wasn't trying to challenge everybody, but I had been carrying these 2 books around in me for a while, and I thought, well, I think I'm going to write them, and I realized they may not be for everybody. And the first was a book about the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, and there are people who have built their entire careers off of parsing just one of this guy's essays. I was sitting in my deer stand reading them on my iPhone, and I thought, well, I think the world needs to know my take on French philosophy. And so I started writing this book, and again, it's just, honestly, it's been kind of the story of my life, which is I'm a roughneck kid. I grew up logging. I like going deer hunting, and I like old pickup trucks, and stock car races, but I also love, I was just at the opera in New York City just a week and a half ago. Didn't get it. That's not the point. It was amazing. And I try to tell my buddies that too. Like, they're like, what are you doing at a modern dance recital? I said, well, it's beautiful. It's amazing. Well, I don't know about that. I said, yeah, and guess what? Within 24 hours, I went to the dirt track stock car races, and nobody asked if I'd been to the modern dance recital. I had a great time at both. So this is just my attempt to say that, yeah, I like to read philosophy. That doesn't mean that I'm an expert. And so thus Montaigne and Barn Boots. And there's a lot of humor in there. But I told my editor when I signed the contract, I said, about half my audience is not going to like this book. And I was right. But it's fine because both of the books that I'm about to talk about, as much as I was concerned about them not being for everybody, not since Population 485 have I written books where I received so much heartfelt communication, letters, emails, people pulling me aside. So I feel like it was worth it because the books, the people that these books do speak to, they speak to on a very deep level. And also in between, I'm still I'm still doing cow jokes, man. It's all right. But the Montaigne book, I just want to tell a quick story. So I knew that when they called me and said, what would you like on the cover? And they ask you that, but they don't really want you to answer. And I said, it's fine. And they had a literal award-winning book jacket designer on the job already. And I just said, you have a professional, you do what you think is best. But I said, I do know that there are basically 3 images of this guy in existence. They're all engravings or etchings. And I said, so I would assume that if you're going to put him on the cover, you're going to use one of these 3 images. And I said, I don't care which one of those 3 you use, but whichever one it is, when you put him on the cover, he has to be wearing a blaze orange ear flapper cap. this is another case where I was on my phone, speakerphone, at this point in rural Falkirk, Wisconsin. They were all in a meeting room in New York. Silence. And then the graphic designer says, "What's a blaze orange ear flapper cap?" And I said, "Well, you're in luck. I have one within reach of my writing desk." And so I picked it up and I took a shot of it with my phone and sent it to him. And to his credit, he then freehand drew a very credible flaps down, of course. But the part where it gets to be me just having to nudge those New York people a little bit. I went to a buddy of mine who's a graphic designer, and he's originally from Hayward, Wisconsin, way up north. And I said, "Hey, man, there's a thing called the Pantone code." I said, "What's the Pantone code for DNR legal blaze orange, hunter orange?" And he gave it to me, and I sent it to this designer in New York, and I said, "Here's the deal. You have to use this color orange." And they said, "Oh, okay." And so a couple months later, they send a PDF of the cover, and it's pretty much as you see it, and he has the cap, but the orange isn't even close. And to be fair to them, it's hard to reproduce that on paper, but it was clear they hadn't used the right code. And so I called, they said, "Well, what do you think of the cover?" And I said, "It's fine," but I asked for one thing, and you didn't do it. And I said, I'm going to insist on that. I said, "You have to use blaze orange." And the designer, the award-winning book jacket designer, said, "Yeah, we talked about that, and we just figured people won't know the difference." I said, "We have reached a cultural impasse." And to their credit, they listened to me, and like I said, it's still hard to reproduce blaze orange on paper. They did the best they could, but check out the spine on this bad boy, right? That is street legal in the state of Wisconsin. So anyway, I wrote a lot of stuff in this book, but the main thing is it's blaze orange, so I'm really happy with that. I'm going to talk just a little bit, and then I'll get to the questions about. So this, my most recent book, it's a novella, which is basically just how do they put it? It's too long to be a short story, too short to be a novel. And this was an idea that hatched with me a long time, probably 4 or 5 years ago. We had one of those winters where we were getting super, super heavy snows, and it just kept accumulating and accumulating. And I have 2 big pole barns, and they were in danger of collapsing, and I would have to get out and try to save them, and I was doing everything I could. And I remember being up in the middle of the night and sweating and cursing and just beside myself trying to clear these pole barns. And I just stopped halfway between the 2 pole barns and thought, you're a knuckleheaded writer with 2 big pole barns full of mostly junk. What if you were a farmer and this was your livelihood? And indeed, that winter, several farmers within just a couple miles of me not only lost sheds, but lost cattle. And in one case, a farmer was killed trying to save his shed. And so that kind of planted the seed. And the other thing was, I just remember looking in my shed one day and going, I read that Marie Kondo thing. I think what we need here is a D9 cat. Like, wouldn't it feel good just to push this all in a hole? And so that was kind of the genesis. And then there was a whole other subtext that's a lot heavier. And that was the part that this is a ruthless book. This is it's about a farmer losing his farm. And it's one of the few times where I took a manuscript and sent it to people that weren't editors ahead of time, including some farmers, and said, "Be ruthless with me, let me know," because I said there's no happy ending, there's no cushion to this. And to a person, they said, "No, you need to write this exactly as you've written it. We want people to understand." So it's fiction, but it's obviously, very obviously drawn on my own observations and neighbors. So I'm just going to read a couple of little bits, including, believe it or not, a light selection from this book. Harold had come to consider the accumulating weight of snow on the farmhouse roof as his life's unfinished business. Daily the load grew on his heart, his head, the creaking eaves. There had been no blizzard. The flakes had fallen through stillness and hush, inch after inch, then foot after foot. With no wind to whip or drift it, the snow simply settled, forming marshmallow abstractions of whatever lay beneath. He thumbed a peephole in the window frost. Every pine tree was capped, every outbuilding banked. The bulldozer beside the machine shed looked as if it were coiffed in meringue. Only the oaks broke the motif, their bare branches arrayed as fossilized veins against the sky. She died a month ago, and he hadn't plowed the driveway since. In the old days, someone would have showed up by now, noticed the lack of tracks, waded through the drifts to knock on the door, waited just long enough not to be nosy, checked in just soon enough to be neighborly. The old days. He had come to despise the phrase. 3 words like hard candy gone rancid on the tongue. The taste of futile yearning, a cold soup of curdled memories, a toothless wine. As a child, he loved listening as the old-timers shot dice around the coffee pot down at Peterson's implement. 30 years later, after all the farm bankruptcies finally pulled Peterson's under, the new generation of oldsters stood in a sad huddle at the auction, nursing convenience store cappuccinos and shaking their heads at things these days. Harold bid $5 for a set of old wrenches, paid at the cashier's trailer, and on the drive home swore he wouldn't die trying to claw the past into the present. So I go on then, and so Harold, he was a dairy farmer, and then he had a barn fire, and he couldn't recover from that, and so then he went to crops, and then from there he just started leasing his land to a big farmer. The farmer who leased Harold's cropland never showed up to farm it. In his stead came hired hand agronomists with wands and laptops and satellite-guided monster machines, doing in a day what had taken Harold weeks. No wasted moves, everything programmed and precise, as opposed to all his years spent grubbing around. One 15 below morning back when he was still milking cows, the worm gear on the manure spreader fractured. He had to hustle off to the parts store because the cow poop was solidifying by the second, and if he didn't get it unloaded, he'd have a half-ton shitsicle on wheels. His rust bomb pickup wouldn't start until he crawled underneath and whacked the solenoid with a hammer. Halfway out the driveway, leaning in tight to the dash, eyeballing the road through a nickel-sized defroster porthole, he switched on the radio just in time to hear an evangelical finance guru declare, "Don't try to outwork stupid." And right out loud, Harold said, "Well, that's really all I got going for me." Side jobs, that's what it came down to. Digging koi ponds for orthopedic surgeons into country living. His wife stocking shelves at the dollar store, both of them hoping the lease money would cover the medical bills and the beef cattle would cover the taxes. Most every original local around here was stuck patching the gaps. Hell, at this point, even meth head was a side job. He'd grown weary of perfection and precision. He longed for worn leather, polished handles. What glacial marvels time in a calloused palm could work against an axe haft. Sometimes when another yoga-panted woman was griping down at him from her Denali over how much he undercharged her for digging her prairie restoration patch, he faded into memories of Leon, the old 3-fingered grader driver, and how all the kids in the schoolyard ran to the fence and waved as Leon passed, his stub-digit hands dancing across the levers, putting a crown on the gravel so the rain wouldn't puddle. The grader man, they called him, a capital letter honorific, and a fact. A good blade man, they'd say, back when even your laziest tavern rat understood the weight those words carried. The good old days, he thought, and then, true to his recent resolution, immediately snuffed the reminiscence. So I'm going to just read one more paragraph. One of the reasons I was nervous about that book, this book, is that a lot of orthopedic surgeons and yoga pant people in Denali's read my books, so but I figured they could take it. So the last little paragraph I'll read, and then we'll take some questions, is this sort of follows in my theme about trying to educate the coast. It is my contention that over the course of recent history, that the American literary scene has neglected any discussion or examination of the torpedo heater. I decided to change that. I hope you know what a torpedo heater is. But I love this little scene because it is a very dark book, but there is humor in it. And the last line in here actually makes me chuckle because I knew these guys. So he's using this torpedo heater to try to melt the snow off his pole barn and save it. It was a fundamentally glorious thing, a torpedo heater. Loud and basic and atmospherically transformative. It even sounded hot. A blow dryer scaled up to set the curls on a woolly mammoth. He could never really explain why items of this nature gave him such pleasure. His raising, he supposed. It was why he loved old pickup trucks, a good knife, a bolt-action rifle. Layered into the pleasure of their simplicity was the way in which they counterbalanced his philosophical predilections, his susceptibility to fuzzy-headed mawkishness. The fact that he took joy from pushing dirt with a bulldozer ensured he'd never get completely lost in the clouds. There was a decal pasted on the side of the heater. It featured a single declaration, bracketed in red exclamation marks. Never leave your torpedo heater unattended. Huh, said Harold, and headed for the house. Thanks a bunch. So I'll take some questions. I'm not sure if I'm not done by 4, do all the lights go off and the doors lock, or so I'll try to keep it close. But are there any questions? You can ask me whatever you want. Yes, in the back. Did I ever work as a nurse is the question. Yes. So I got a 4-year degree in nursing, and then I worked as a nurse for under 2 years. But again, as in the introduction, it was an accident. I worked right out of college. I worked for an oral maxillofacial surgeon. And then when I quit nursing to try to write, I didn't leave because I was upset or anything. I literally went to the library and checked out a book on how to be a writer. And I thought, well, I'll try this, but I'm sure that in 3 months, I'll just go back to nursing. My last job as a nurse officially was I worked on a neuro rehab unit with traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, amputations and strokes. So that was my last official job. I did, in one of the books, I think in Truck, I write about my buddy Ozzy, who's quadriplegic. And I worked as his nurse for a while I was writing. But as I describe in the book, I got this call out of the blue, and it was him, and he's a very high-level quadriplegic, and he said, I need nurses, because he lived in a very rural area, and I need a nurse because I'm having a hard time finding nurses. And I said, boy, I have my license and everything, and I do know, but I said, I haven't practiced for a long time. He's like, that's okay. And when I started working for Ozzy during the stretch that I did, I quickly discovered that his definition of nurse was pretty loose because, as it turns out, it included motorcycle driving, meth dealers, and not kidding, great folks. I mean, we had a lot of good times, but I definitely really didn't need to worry about showing him my license, as it turns out. But yeah, honestly, in 1989, the summer of 1989, I thought, I'm going to try writing and see what happens. And I still, the backpack's out in the other room, but there is an up-to-date nursing license in that backpack if things go horribly wrong. So there was a question here, yes?
Do you or have you, or what is your feelings about shirts and ties?
My feelings about shirts and ties? It's funny, so I'm going to try and answer this in 2 stages. I just went to a little social event recently. I'm a community representative on the local hospital board. I was asked to be on that board, and I was like, that is the last thing I need to do. And I went home to my wife, and I said, they've asked me to be on the hospital board. And my wife said, it sounds like kind of a grown-up thing. I think you should do it. She's not, no. But I just went, there was a very high-ranking fellow who just was unfortunately, a terrific person and like a lot of really terrific people, he just got a much better offer at another entity, and I just went to his little going away thing, and he is very much the suit and tie. And I showed up not dressed even as nice as I am right now, and I said to him, I said, well, first of all, congratulations. I said, have you finally got promoted to the point where you get to go to meetings looking like this? And he's like, no, I'll keep trying. Because I do like that I get to go to meetings in big, tall skyscrapers in big cities, and I can just wear what I was wearing last Tuesday. So I don't care for suits and ties, but I do keep them on retainer, for I do believe in wearing them out of respect. I will wear them to a wedding or a funeral. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good for you. Yes.
Have you left collecting any more Sienna hubcaps?
So he's referring to the bit that I did in that PBS special. The Sienna is here, and no, it's still 2 out of 4 hubcaps. Yeah. I always tell people that things are going okay. I'm driving it showed up here today in my tour bus, a 2002 Toyota Sienna. And I said, things aren't completely bad. We have made it up to 2 out of 4 hubcaps. And if you see me do the bit, you know I mount them both on the same side, so that depending on what kind of image I'm trying to project that day. So, nice. Yes.
Any plans for a part 2 to Scavengers?
Oh man, this question haunts me. So I wrote a book called The Scavengers, which is for young readers, although at least half of the audience is adult. That's not just me. Most young adult books are good enough that adults read them. And when I signed the contract, it was a 2-book contract. And so the sequel was built into the contract. What I didn't realize at the time, because I had never worked in that genre, I had no idea how ravenous those readers are for sequels. And I wish that I had written both books and then turned them in. What happened is I finished that one. It was pretty well received, but I had already gone on to 2 other projects. And I think it's 8 years now. It is 80% done. I was working on it last week, but I have quit saying when it's coming out, because I literally have kids coming up to me going, I'm in college now. I'm not even joking. Yeah. There, see, this is, yeah. So tell her, unless I die, it's coming, yeah. So, yes.
Where is Tom's cannon target?
Ah,
I swear the last time I drove up north or came home,
yeah.
it was gone.
It might be. So one of the sad things about life is time passes. 20 years since I wrote the Population 45 book, I get emails from people, and they're mostly nice, but they'll say, we loved your book, Population, and we were on a vacation up north, so we made a special point of going to New Auburn and driving through, and it's nothing like you described it. And I'm going, correct. What happened? Like 25 years? You know, it's like, so Tom is still alive, still cranky. But he finally, 2 years ago, for years, his place is just overflowing. And if you read the book, and it was the one with the pictures, you can see overflowing with stuff. And his daughter would say, Tom, we got to take care of this stuff so that someone's not stuck with it. And he would always say, I'm leaving it for the next guy. Well, 2 summers ago, he gave that same response, and his son-in-law was there. And his son-in-law said, Tom, I'm the next guy, and I'm 69 years old. And so they did finally have kind of a semi-auction, and it was really hard for Tom, but I will say that once they started, it was like a weight lifted. If you talk to him, he'll tell you why he's not happy about it, but he's happy about it. But all of the cannons were sold or given to somebody. So he might not have, I think he kept the one, though. I think he kept the main one. And that's the one this gentleman's referring to. If you drive on I-94 south of Eau Claire, you're headed north. I mean, technically west, but westbound. But there's a barn that's right up to the fence. And in the book, Visiting Tom, I wrote about that barn and why it's right next to the fence. And if you looked quickly to the right and the corn wasn't tall, you would see a giant target up against the tree line that Tom would shoot at with his homemade cannon. And there's all kinds of stories about that cannon. It is not a lawn ornament. Like the barrel alone weighs 300 pounds. He turned it all himself. He made the wheels himself, the spokes himself, the rims. He makes his own black powder. That is a slightly extra legal operation. Although what I say to people is that when he gets nervous about the ATF busting his powder making operation, he calms his nerves by going in the other shed where he takes a little slash off the moonshine he's making. But my other favorite thing about the cannon, if you read the book, you know this, he doesn't shoot cannonballs. He fills Dinty Moore beef stew cans with concrete and shoots them. And they knuckleball a little bit, so they're not super accurate, but you still wouldn't want to stand up there by that target, because he does occasionally hit it, and it's pretty impressive. So, yeah. Yes?
You still have the International Harvester?
I do still have the International Harvester. I ran it for several years, even ran it long enough so that when I got married, my elder daughter got to ride in it with me. But when we moved to the farm that I wrote about in Coop, it's extremely hilly. And those old Internationals, they don't really have an emergency brake. They have a thing that clamps on it's like kind of the transmission, and it's worthless. You always carry a piece of firewood. That's your emergency brake, right? Yeah. And honestly, it was a combination of I really couldn't use it much on the farm. And secondly, the other thing I learned a long time ago, and I think I maybe wrote about this in the book, that particular model is super low geared. And because it's low geared, if you happen to have it in gear and you start rolling down the hill and you pop the clutch out, it snaps the drivetrain. So I parked it and mostly wasn't running it, but the classic kind of the same cycle. Well, I'll get her going here in a year or two. My given daughter, her high school graduation came, and in a moment that still, warms my heart, she said, "Dad, I want one of my graduation pictures to be with that truck, because I have fond memories of you driving me." So I said, well, it won't start, but I'll pull it out of the shed and I hooked the tractor up to it and tried to pull it out, and the back axle is froze solid. So do I still have it? Yes. Would my wife like to put it on Craigslist? Yes. Would she be wrong to do that? Probably not. Maybe one more question if there is one. Otherwise, I will turn you. Oh, yes, sir.
How is your pursuit going to have everything in your life on wheels?
What? So that's what in vinyl album world they would call a deep cut. Many years ago, I did a piece for Wisconsin Public Television, and they came to my pole barn, the same one that led to me writing the 40 Acres Deep book. And I was on a mission, and I still am. I want everything in my life to be on wheels, so I can just move it where I want it, especially in the pole barn and the shop. I would say I've gained a little bit. Everything that was on wheels for that show is still on wheels. And I recently, just a year ago, upgraded, I shouldn't reveal this, but I spent a little bit of money and upgraded to one of those compartmental tool chest systems. I can wheel everything everywhere. Yeah, so thank you for following up on that. Yeah. It's the one area in my life where I feel like I'm kind of getting it together. So here's the deal. First of all, a great big thank you to the library. So I am not famous. My name is recognizable in certain circles, usually involving NPR tote bags. Although I'm also proud to say there's certain circles where there are more feed bags than NPR tote bags, where my name is also recognized. But I am not famous, but I get way more requests than I can deal with, and so I have a booking agent who handles all this stuff. He's just a dude named Ben, as you know. But this event here starts because many months ago someone would have approached us and worked with Ben and put in all the time and the volunteers and the folks who are here. So firstly, before I say goodbye, I want to acknowledge the library and all the work they did. Yeah. And libraries just doing so much important work these days. Always have, but we're noticing some of the extra work they're doing. And then I would just like to thank you. I didn't plan any of this, and it's a very weird, like I said, not famous, but I can get enough folks to come and listen to these stories, and I never lose gratitude for that. This is how we have a little family business, basically, and this is how we do it. And then the last thing I'll say is if you need any info about me or you need to find out about the books, the ones I didn't mention, sneezingcow.com, that's the place to go. I have a mailing list there. If you sign up, we let you know if I'm coming to the area or if I have a new book out. The very first post you'll see on there is just sort of a summary of all the things we got going on. It's a very simple post at sneezingcow.com. That comes from a humor album I did a long time ago called Never Stand Behind a Sneezing Cow. Shouldn't have to explain that to anybody in this room. But again, on the coasts, I got to break out charts. You know, I just tell them basically it's a situation involving several of the properties of physics, contents under pressure, ballistics, path of least resistance, and of course, inertia, although in this case you might refer to it as inertia. If you can do better. I always say, hey, that one was right there for the taking. And I also say, I don't know if it's ever happened to any of you. It has happened to me growing up on the farm. It is a jaw-dropping experience, although that would not be your best move. So sneezingcow.com, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go out to this table, and I will hang out there as long as you like to sign books. Then we're moving, some of us are moving to another location. I don't know much about that, but anyway, thank you so much, and I'll see you out there.